Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Lavish Bhandari, President CSEP, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this special event, which is a combination of release of two studies done by Rahul, Nikhil, and Rajasekhar on DISCOMs. So CSEP is a, we like to believe that we are a leading and independent research institute. We work on a range of important issues, including, of course, energy, including climate change, on climate finance, on critical minerals, health, international relations, and so on. This work that comes out of a team which has been working on these issues for many years now, and it comes out of a lot of detailed data work, which is something that CSEP really prides itself in, where we believe in not just independent work, but credible data analysis and robust methods. Suman Bery, the Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, will be giving us special remarks. I believe he has sent those, Rahul, right? But due to a special meeting with the PM, he may not be able to, he won't be able to join us today.
In person.
Yes, in person. Of course, Mr. Bery is not just a noted economist, but he also has a strong energy background, having been the chief economist of Shell in a previous avatar. The Secretary of Power, Mr. Alok Kumar, also has had an unavoidable meeting, and we regret he will not be able to join us. But of course, we are in touch with him, and he has promised to come back to us with his response. Highlight of this afternoon will be a panel discussion with Mr. Ahluwalia, the former CERC Chairman and Secretary Power, Mr. K Pujari, and Prayas Fellow, and Josey. I don't want to get into the technical issues here, but I do want to just mention that Mr. Ahluwalia was the first, or was first looked into these issues perhaps more than 2 decades back, when he chaired the first committee dealing with DISCOM finances. So this is a very old festering problem in a sense, and this clearly will be a fairly interesting discussion. So thank you again for joining us, and I will not keep the interesting stuff between you and Rahul, so please move on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lavish, and thank you everyone for joining us, especially our distinguished panelists who are not just kind enough, but maybe brave enough to really deliberate openly on some of these vexing challenges that aren't solvable by just right versus wrong, because there are trade-offs in a lot of these issues. So before I get to the panel, we do want to open with very limited highlights of our studies. Now, these two studies, which are now, there are copies up front, and there are these are the culmination of a lot of work, and we can give only highlights, which I'll request my colleagues Nikhil and Rajasekhar to give. I am Rahul Tongia, a scholar in this domain. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself, but I think this placard does the job. And DISCOMs are a key part of the energy transition, and in fact, the entire energy ecosystem, electricity ecosystem in the country. And so figuring out their finances towards sustainability, now that word will have more than one meaning, is really what we're here to discuss. And if I could now request Nikhil and Rajasekhar to just give highlights of some of the studies and what we have found.
So thank you, Rahul, and welcome all. So as Rahul said, is it fine? Yeah. So as Rahul mentioned, this is a summary of key highlights of 2 of our studies. So the motivation, like we know that power sector has evolved over time, where generation capacity has increased, network has improved, but DISCOMs are still considered to be the weakest link, and they are struggling with the energy losses, financial losses, where they have required government support and periodic bailouts. So why DISCOM has a loss? So they are basically a regulated entity, and they work on a cost plus return basis. So theoretically, their tariff should be enough to cover the cost. But conventional wisdom is, and in theory, if you understand, if there is any loss, then financial gap. So this is due to the non-performance of the DISCOM. Through our studies, what we have found that this is not true, and there is a systemic issue which need broader fixes. Like AT&C alone are not explaining the whole gap. So what we have done cash-based accounting. Unlike what we have seen in PFC and other accounts, which are accrual accounting, in recent year we have seen in last two reports, PFC has also started cash-adjusted gap accounting, which is close to the numbers what we have found. And we have analyzed all the public DISCOMs over 15 years from financial year 7 to financial year 21. And we have tried to map their performance to their annual financial gap and then how it lead to their balance sheet. So AT&C is a performance parameter for the DISCOM, which is a hybrid of two different losses. One is billing loss, which is energy loss in the system, and second is collection loss, which is your rupees losses. So this is to understand the financial gap. This is to be seen relative to the performance is to be seen relative to their targets. For let's take an example for FY21. The target for billing loss was 12.85%, and they exceed the target by 3.53%. So this 3.53% is actually leading to the financial gap. Same on the collection side, the target was 0.57%, where they exceed the target, and it has two components. One is collection loss from the consumers directly, which was 3.87%, and second, non-payment of subsidy from the states, which is 3.5%. So in FY21, the financial gap we found was 1.04 lakh crore. We apportion it across the different attributable factors, and what we found that excess distribution network loss was only 18,000 crore. And then excess non-consumer collection was 22,000 crore, which has a measurable share from government users. Then subsidy unpaid was 20,000 crore. And there is a fourth component, which is regulatory asset, 7,000 crore. It is a cost acknowledged by the regulator, but not given commensurate tariff to recover that cost. Adding all four factors doesn't account for the whole gap of 1.04 lakh crore. So we found that there is still a gap of 36,000 crore, and that we have identified as residual gap. So what is residual gap? If we understand it, in theory, if a DISCOM perform by the targets and there is no subsidy non-payment and there is no regulatory asset creation, there should be no gap. But what we found, there is still a gap which is of tens of thousand crore every year. And being a regulated entity, why they are having a residual gap? That's a question. So to understand it, we analyze for FY19 that from the tariff order setting time, how the cost and revenue has shifted, and what is the end position in the ex post scenario. And we found that this residual gap is an outcome of tariff setting process. So sorry, this is a complex slide. I'll take some time over this. So at the time of starting here, the ex-ante gap was almost zero. They were slightly surplus. So the all numbers are normalized on energy sold basis. So the number was they were slightly surplus by 4 paisa. There was increase in cost by, you can see the black columns. Then there was decrease in revenue. And it lead to a gross gap of 1.64 rupees per kilowatt hour. With the help of extra support from additional from other income and additional grants, which is not visible at the time of tariff setting, it's not the part of tariff setting, the gross gap reduced to 1 rupee per kilowatt hour. So let's look at the subcomponents. So the change in cost of power is the highest shift, which is 66 rupees per kilo, 0.66 rupees per kilowatt hour. Then your other cost, the DISCOM, the factors which are under DISCOM purview, distribution network loss and consumer collection loss. This is 39 paisa, which are very this is a small share of total gap. total gross gap. So rest other component, we are not saying everything, but rest other component should come back with the post reconciliation method, which is the process is true up. And we found that it is not working as expected. So in FY19, only 7 paisa was embedded as the part of pass true up, and which is very less in compared to the exposed gap what we have found of 1 rupees. So we couldn't able to estimate the right number of true up because there is opacity, reasoning changes time to time, and so we are not saying everything is to be allowed, but still the 7 paisa is very less compared to the exposed gap what we have found. So, and even if everything is allowed and passed by the regulator and to be recovered in the next tariff period, the process itself has a 2-year lag, which adds extra carrying cost to it. Now I request Rajasekhar to please share the trend, implication and recommendations.
We carried this cash basis gap analysis for 15 years from 2006-07 to financial year 2020-21. And this chart presents this gap analysis. And if you see the trend, the gap is steadily increasing. And this is essentially due to the increase in volumes and also the increase in prices due to inflation. But the good part is that residual gap is decreasing both in absolute terms as well as in percentage terms. But the other components are varying depending on the relative contribution to the overall gap. However, in FY 2021, the gaps are increasing. The components of consumer contribution or consumer non-collection or distribution loss and subsidy, etc., they're increasing, and we may ignore perhaps because of effect of COVID-19. And if we add all these gap components, just a plain summation, we find the cumulative gap at the level of 10 lakh crores, and out of which the residual gap is the biggest one, and it is not attributable to any of the 4 factors that are indicated down the stack, like regulatory assets, subsidy, unpaid, and consumer non-collection, distribution network loss, etc. And importantly, the consumer non-collection and distribution network loss, which are under the DISCOM's purview, together constitute just 28% of the total gap. Now, what are the implications? And some losses are gone forever, just like billing losses, and some losses like consumer non-collection and regulatory asset become receivables in the balance sheet, and some like subsidy unpaid is not visible at all on the balance sheets. And the fundamental issue is at the tariff level, is the tariff covering the costs? The red dots indicate the tariff shortfall versus the cost structure. And this is independent of performance of financial performance of DISCOMs like AT&C losses. And this is stabilized in the range of say 13 to 15% over the last 8 years. But these tariff shortfalls are moderately offset thanks to the grants and other income, which is not part of the regulatory process at the tariff setting time. However, these losses, if we add or if we factor in the DISCOM's performance, then for example for FY 2021, the shortfall comes at the level of 14%. And how the DISCOMs cope with this? And the financial, the cash basis losses are difficult for the distribution utilities, even if they are profitable on accrual basis. So they delay payments, and they delay payments to the GenCos and other suppliers. But these are different from the debt they take from the banks and financial institutions. And of course, we cannot apportion the debt components that they've taken for the regular business needs and the need that to meet their cash crunch. And apart from these two, they also rely on equity infusions. Like, for 5 years, we calculated over 39 DISCOMs from FY 13-14 to FY 18-19. We found the equity infusion 4x. And this equity, if used for coping, then that may not fully get the full return on it. And how it impacts the balance sheet. The mounting losses erode the equity, and the DISCOM's net worth, some of the DISCOM's net worth turns negative. And the residual gap can be tracked with the change in the accumulated deficits on the balance sheets. So now, the DISCOMs are heterogeneous. Like each DISCOM's pain points or their gap components are different from the others. Hence, one solution fits all does not work here. So we tried to analyze this issue, for example, taking for financial year 20 data. On that basis, we found that there is no gap in respect of 7 DISCOMs. And if subsidies are paid, then 3 DISCOMs will be turning positive. And of course, payment of subsidies is in the jurisdiction of the state governments. And in addition to payment of subsidies, if regulatory assets issue is also addressed by the regulators, 2 more DISCOMs will be turning positive. And in addition to subsidy and regulatory assets, if DISCOMs make efforts to bring the distribution network losses also as per the targets, then 3 more DISCOMs will be turning positive. And in addition to the above 3, like subsidy, regulatory asset, and distribution network losses, if DISCOMs bring about this consumer non-collection losses also as per targets, 10 more DISCOMs will turn positive. But here, the challenge is substantial part of the consumer non-payments are from the government users, like state department offices, rural and urban bodies, etc. But even after turning around and working on the 4 components like subsidy, regulatory asset and distribution network loss and consumer non-collection losses, still 18 DISCOMs are in red, which at the macro level appear to need a tariff rise. But these 18 DISCOMs have residual gap, which need to go through a regulatory process in which all stakeholders have a critical role to play. So apart from the tariff-related recommendations, there are other fixes, like improved processes. We need better data. We need better metering. We need to focus on the existing norms. And importantly, the institutional improvements are also needed for better planning and capacity building. And this study this presentation particularly is given with a narrow, limited focus. And I request you all to read through the papers. In this presentation, we've not covered the issues like cross-subsidy analysis, tariff design related issues, and return on equity and data-related issues. But we closed this study with FY21 data. So the recent efforts of government to bring about a positive change could not be included in this study. For example, RDSS, LPS rules, and mandate for carrying out timely audits, all these things emphasize and all these things facilitate to improve upon the losses, to bring in more liquidity, to address the residual, and other cash basis losses. But they all work towards the present problems and the future issues. But merely addressing the AT&C losses would not address the residual gap and the legacy losses. With this, I close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikhil and Rajasekhar. it's a bit of a rushed, a 30,000, 50,000 foot view that you've gotten, but we do encourage you to see the reports with the nuances and details. And I want to just, at the risk of oversimplification, take away two main summaries from this effort. One, that we've all heard aggregate technical and commercial, AT&C loss, oh, these DISCOMs are not behaving, not performing. That's a factor, but it's not the entire problem. Second, that the processes have some things we need to rectify. So true-ups are there, but they're not working as we need them to do. Now, whether it's because there's pressure to keep tariffs low or what else is something that will be discussed with our panelists. So that is another key takeaway from these studies. I know a lot of people, including an op-ed recently, just focused on these headline numbers. I don't think we want to talk about this headline gap. I mean, these are all big numbers and different methodologies lead you to different insights. But our insight is really simple, that if you go from accrual accounting to cash accounting, you get a slightly different picture. Let's not worry about the numbers per se, but cash gives you a different insight. It's not how long-term viable the institution or entity is, but also what are they dealing with in the present. So cash accounting is useful, and I'm glad PFC has now been doing it recently. We've done it manually because it wasn't there for the last 15 years. In fact, I'm happy to note, just yesterday, PFC released the data for FY22. So obviously we cannot have it in our studies. And it shows quite an improvement in AT&C losses, especially collection. And anecdotal or initial data for 23 shows a continuation of these positive trends. So the government is doing a lot of effort. The trend is improving. But our insights through a historical forensic time analysis is on the processes and this residual gap, which AT&C improvements, for example, and operational improvements, which are vital, are insufficient. So these are the takeaways. I do request everyone to go through more details. And for those who are online, you can put in questions as our panel proceeds on the chat session. We'll try and get to some of that maybe through the Q&A or at least afterwards. And even in general, after our panel, when we have discussion questions from you, I would request everyone to focus less on a number per se, but on the larger insights and the policy issues that are worthy of deliberation with a panel like we have today. With this, I want to now switch gears, and we have a special address by Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, Shri Suman Bery. He was not able to get back. He may still be able to join us. He said that he will see his schedule, but he has shared with us some special remarks that request you to please load.
Good afternoon. Let me start by congratulating CSEP and the team that has done what I would consider another close to landmark study in the whole area of power and energy. I was very much looking forward to being with you in person to demonstrate solidarity with this program of work, which is extremely detailed and is the kind of work that a top-level think tank should be undertaking. But it is one of the hazards of my position that I'm not really the master of my own program. And I say this after having specifically asked Rahul and the organizers to hold this at this time, thinking it was less subject to event risk. I've only so far seen the executive summary. So in my remarks, I apologize if I miss what is in the larger studies, and I will certainly be asking NITI staff to study the full reports more carefully. But it's clear that the studies by CSEP comprehensively analyze DISCOM finances and try to untangle the root cause of their operational and financial losses. These analyses, which extend to DISCOM balance sheets and income statements, I imagine, as well as the tariff setting processes, lead to a range of recommendations that should help reinforce DISCOM sustainability. And it's evident that the sector needs and deserves new approaches to regulation, including revamping the tariff setting process, especially the true-up process, to close the residual gap. And it's striking and important that what is directly within the control of DISCOMs turns out to be a relatively small part of the gap between ex ante and ex post financial outcomes. There are a range of issues beyond the ambit of tariff and tariff setting, which include improvements in planning, in power procurement, also in terms of the expected consumer mix over time, and in DISCOM management. I should perhaps add that much of the story is familiar to me because I inherited from your former president, Rakesh Mohan, the drafting of the electricity bill when I took over from him in 2001, and more importantly, inherited Gajendra Haldia, who has been was such an important force in many aspects of the power sector and privatization more generally. I would, on the basis of a cursory reading, just like to make 5 points. I was going to join you at the end. Perhaps making these points at the beginning will help stimulate the discussion. The first is, and this is particularly important for NITI Aayog, do the reports, the underlying reports, not the executive summary, actually exploit the vast diversity of outcomes across India's states and union territories? Because there has been a lot of experimentation. And so is there a factor analysis or regression analysis of why outcomes differ? A second question that arises is, is India really atypical? And if so, why? How do other countries avoid the politicization of tariffs or, as it were, the ex ante and ex post differences? And linked to that, I suppose, since there was so much emphasis on setting up in the initial excitement of the late 90s independent regulators, have the regulators, including at the federal level, at the union level, have they been independent? And do we have, would institutional changes in the regulators make much a difference? And that's linked up with another question. I mean, the issue of trying to deal with the DISCOM losses has been with us a long time. And on the panel is Montek Ahluwalia, and some of these schemes, I think, were developed when he was deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And of course, in the life of this government, we've had the Uday scheme. So what is it exactly that those reform efforts have missed? Two final points, if I may. One is that the issue of whether we are talking in accrual accounting or cash accounting seems to matter, and that requires its own terminology, because in the executive summary there are terms like revenue and cost. Now these are to my knowledge, largely accrual accounting concepts, and indeed a profit and loss statement uh, is, as it were, an accrual accounting. And yet I get the sense, which is not absolutely clear from the executive summary, that what we're really talking about is cash. And so which matters more and why it matters more, I think are issues that I hope that the discussion would illuminate and may actually involve in a new strand of research. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a point that's been made in past CSEP papers, is that as electrification becomes the heart of India's green strategy, and I should add, as the generation moves from what it was in the mid-90s, largely public sector, to a mix of public and private sector, and as we try and attract global capital, the DISCOMs will end up being a very important link in the chain. And so, as Montek, Ahluwalia and Utkarsh Patel have indicated, sorting this out is really fundamental for us to realize our green aspirations. In brief, India's power sector is ripe for bold, comprehensive reforms. Our tariff structures are complex. There exist more than 19 tariff categories in some states. This needs to be simplified. I've already mentioned that state electricity regulatory commissions must function as independent regulators. Any dues from local government bodies overdue for more than a year may be considered for payment from the budgetary allocation of the states directly to DISCOMs. Smart metering in urban and rural areas should be an important focus for achieving better efficiency of DISCOM. And there's also a need to separate the content and carriage business. So with these remarks, again, my apologies for not being there in person, not learning from what is going to be a rich discussion. CSEP does have a tradition of posting discussions on YouTube. I don't know if this is an open discussion. I rather suspect it is, in which case I'll be able to catch it later. But with thanks to Rahul and his team for including me on the program, I wish the event every success. Thank you.
If you could just put the slides back. Yeah. So, I mean, Mr. Bery has given a very elegant view, sitting from a lens that starts with a historical perspective and really ties it into the future ambitions that we have as a country. And a lot of those pathways do come through the DISCOMs. And so that is really the focus for our deliberation with the very distinguished panel. I will not, in fact, formally introduce them by reading their bios because all of the information has been posted and they're all well known. It's worth, of course, mentioning that Mr. Pujari has seen things from different sides, both executive and regulator. So I think you will have some of the most unique insights into the system. Mr. Ahluwalia, of course, has helped not only at the Planning Commission, but a number of committees that have looked at infrastructure, at DISCOMs specifically. Notice I didn't use the word bailout. And we have Josey, fellow at Prayas, who's an expert on DISCOMs, who's really close to me. I would think, we have a small geek club where we really talk details and minutiae, but at the same time push each other to think big picture as well. So glad you could join us from Pune. So before I start the panel, I'll just remind everyone to keep questions ready, but hopefully keep your questions more for our panelists, not on the studies per se, because I'm skeptical you've read through all of them just yet. And also our authors will be available for more detailed sort of technical discussions on some of the findings. But it's really the DISCOMs and their sustainability that all of us are after. We know that, if I just had this oversimplification as a starting point that, well, we need to have better tariffs. Well, that's a motherhood sort of a statement. You won't get any arguments, but it's much more complex and nuanced than that. So taking from the presentations, I have 4 sets of questions or clusters of questions for our panelists. These are, of course, just guides. I hope it's a very free-flowing conversation. People should please push back if I say something or someone else says something that they either disagree with or want to have a new thread from. First issue is the elephant in the room. Raising tariffs. You may need to do that. The second is really about institutions and processes, and it's not just the true-ups that are there. The third set really relates to DISCOMs and the energy transition, and it's a bi-directional relationship. DISCOMs are viewed as the number one counterparty risk when you ask a solar developer, what's going on, is one side of it. But the second is the transition also changes the planning from both a supply perspective and a demand perspective for what the DISCOMs would need to face, which then ties directly to tariffs. You have a system today with cross-subsidies across consumer classes, and we'll discuss more about how that may change with our panel. And then lastly, we should really start to think outside the box maybe, or out of our comfort zone in what could the future look like. Notice I didn't say the word should, because that's a harder call. But what could the future of DISCOMs look like, and what are the pros and cons? At one end, you've got privatization as one option, but there's also interim or in-between steps that we can discuss. So with these sorts of threads, I would now like to request Mr. Ahluwalia to share any opening thoughts, if you wish to share, before we get to some more specific questions and threads.
Thank you. Thanks, Rahul. Well, first of all, let me join Suman's pretty fulsome praise for the study, because I do think we do need exactly this kind of detailed stuff. Mind you, you've thrown us somewhat off track by saying, oh, you didn't have the most recent data, and whatever they are, they show a huge improvement. I sincerely hope you're right. But if that is indeed the case, you should update this study to include the most recent data.
We will have updates,
Because,
yes.
what I mean is very quickly, because I think there's not much point us talking about it's a mess, but with a footnote, but the latest data say it isn't a mess. I'm not very convinced whether that is true. After all, you're really talking about cash accounting, so I don't know how that weighs. That's point number one. Point number two, I'm not persuaded by the argument you make that it isn't the fault of the DISCOMs. Now, I haven't done enough work or thinking to be able to persuade people what exactly I think is wrong. But my feeling is that as long as this whole thing is wrapped up into a public sector mode of operation, everybody will be conspiring to keep tariffs low. Chief ministers tell DISCOMs, but don't ask for too much tariff increase. You make some assumption that you will improve your efficiency, so you don't need to increase the tariffs. Now, all this ultimately, of course, goes into true-ups, and then you say the true-ups are not actually implemented, and that's sort of blamed on the regulators. But the regulators are also ultimately, they are former government servants. So there is a conspiracy on the part of a number of well-meaning people to tolerate a system that won't actually raise tariffs. And the moment you get that, everybody's behavior is conditioned by it. So, for example, I think you rightly say that, if it's really the case that the problem is not the inefficiency of the DISCOMs, then what is all this nonsense about privatizing DISCOMs, which is very fair. But, I feel what would happen is that if you privatize DISCOMs, then many of these institutional weaknesses would be surfaced through the system, which at the moment they're not. They're swept under the carpet. Now that's, again, a hypothesis. It may or may not be true. But you know, there are so many. I mean, for example, one of the most obvious things, I think it comes out in your paper, the tariffs do not observe the national tariff policy of subsidies should not be, I mean,
Cross-subsidies.
overcharging should not be more than 20%. So there's a complete departure. In fact, you have a very nice, at least you showed me a very nice scatter of the Indian tariffs across different categories. Is much wider than any other country. And I think this is really simply not being serious. So I wish I had either the time or the skill. I emphasize the skill also because you guys have that to kind of go into it in greater depth. But I have a feeling that we are underestimating, if you like, the institutional bias which runs through the system because it's public sector dominated, subject to chief minister's control. And the idea that that kind of a system will actually generate the right results, I am not convinced. That's why I personally have always said, I mean, when I used to meet chief ministers, I used to say this to them, that look, of course, privatization is not a panacea, but it would be a good idea for every state to privatize distribution in 2 or 3 areas, and then let's see if that works better or not. So you need to give it some thought rather than simply sort of dismiss it. That's actually my main concern. That plus the fact that the regulators do not seem to be following the national tariff policy. I don't know constitutionally whether they are bound to. You know, I mean, after all, the distribution is a state subject. So I don't know whether the national tariff policy, it may be binding the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, but does it bind the State Electricity Regulatory Commission as much as one would think? I don't know. But I think we need to look at that also. But anyway, congratulations on, I mean, this paper raises the level at which this kind of discussion can actually take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. I think even Mr. Pujari may have some thoughts on the jurisdictional aspect. Perhaps we could request him later on to get to that. On privatization, I hope we come back to it, that I agree, the privatization helps the institutional, and it's a helpful step. It may not address everything, because Delhi, for example, has private DISCOMs, and it also has some of the higher regulatory assets compared to the country. So there are many things, but fully agree with the point. I'll just clarify or just restate something. I didn't mean to say it. Maybe it was, I don't want anyone to misinterpret. One, we're saying that not everything is the DISCOM's fault. We didn't say DISCOMs have no role or no thing. So let's be clear. It's not just about the percentage, but even how they engage with regulators and how they do their homework, and also many other layers that are in the paper in much more depth. The second, the main, the current improvements will be very helpful. I think I'm not saying we're not going to look at them very rapidly, but those don't focus on the residual or legacy gaps, which are a distinct thing. So I think the really strong effort the government has been putting in, which has turned around certain things, and the liquidity, for example, the late payment surcharges to generators if you don't pay, they've really primed that pump. Who would have thought you'd have such a bold step? And what we're seeing is states are coming on board to that. But these address parts of the problem. There's more to be done. But the trends are all great, but our study focuses on the process and the residual, which is not yet directly addressed, in part because a lot of the tariff issues are a state issue. They're not directly under central purview. So with those small clarifications, I now request Mr. Pujari to share some opening thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to join Mr. Ahluwalia in commending the very painstaking reports with a lot of data and then over a time frame of 15 years which has been collected. And every research student knows how difficult it is to collect data from hundreds of DISCOMs because they are in different formats. They are no, the books are in different formats, the interpretation is different. So really it is highly commendable that you could put them together and then come out with very, very conclusive sort of recommendations. Yeah, we will not like to really paint in whether DISCOMs are responsible or not. But what the study does, it throws highlights certain areas where action is required. If the ex ante, the gap is 0 and ex post the gap becomes high, then the fault could be that the assumptions or data that was put and it was considered was not correct. So either the regulator should ask proper question depending on the past information, saying that in the last 3 years the gap has increased. When it does the tariff setting for the next term of tariff, you should be able to ask questions why in the past it has happened and why the correct information is not coming, or the assumptions that the regulator made earlier, it needs to introspect and find out whether those assumptions are correct or not. So it gives a guiding sort of or a pointer to both the regulator and the DISCOM to look at those information, assumptions and data more honestly and in an integrated manner. So that's the outcome of this. I mean, so more truly the tariff setting should be done. If the DISCOM, as was pointed out by Mr. Ahluwalia, if they don't come forth or give the correct information or correct data based on which the tariffs are being proposed or being accepted by the regulator, the regulator has all the right to look at it and ask the correct questions and correct information. So that's this if the gap increases so much ex post, so there's gives a indication to basically or brings highlights that both the regulator and the DISCOMs need to look at the process itself. And I don't think any political interference or intervention does come in that, because it is basically basically getting the correct information. Secondly, if you look at the analysis, it says that the cost contribute in the gap, the cost or the expenses contributes about 60% and revenue contributes about 40%. And largely the cost of power is the cost of power procurement, which is basically generation. So that is a known factor. I think if you look at the trend, there is a trend for increasing cost over the years. So if that is so, then regulator and the DISCOM should factor it straight away. I mean, if the last CAGR is about 6%, every last 5 years or 10 years, the power cost is increased by 6%, you should actually factor in 6-7% of power cost increase, whether the DISCOMs has asked for it or not. It is the regulator. So these are the issues that comes out from these studies, and it gives a guiding sort of platform for the regulator to look at differently. Secondly, the true up is very, very interesting point that yes, your assumptions on the basis on which you have fixed the tariff may change over the coming years, and there is a gap, and the true up has been provided for. But true up needs to be done quickly. It takes time, because as a CRC also we realize that the true up process takes huge amount of time, not because nobody is interested, because the petitions are filed, so many data are asked for, and it has to be heard. All the parties need to be heard. So suppose NTPC power station, every power station there are 5 or 6 beneficiaries and DISCOMs. So every petition has to be heard. And you just can't brush away and not give them the opportunity of making their cases. So it takes time. I mean, it's just that the whole process is so complicated, and since the huge amount of money is involved, it takes time. Now that leads to what has been said is that if the true up takes 2 years or 3 years, in between the carrying cost really builds up, and the base is higher, the carrying cost will be higher. Then how does you address that? I mean, that's inherent built gap gets created. So we need to look at it whether, that's why in CRC we try to find out whether we can have sort of normative setting, instead of going and basically specifying every small regulation, mostly you go for a normative tariff setting and allow certain parameters to be really debated and discussed. How far it is logical, how far it is implementable, that needs to be tested. I hope, because the way the system is, and if you look at the CRC as in today, also about 700 petitions are pending. So at any point at time, 700 petitions are pending. Even if they do 100 petitions, they dispose of every month, that 700 petitions keep pending, and it takes about 2-3 years for every petition to be disposed of. Not that they're not working, but then this is how the system is. So obviously there's an inbuilt sort of shortcoming in the system which creates this sort of liabilities. So this study brings that out, saying that yes, it takes 2 to 3 years for the true up, and it not with nobody's fault, with or best intention, then automatically the cost is there, and it gets loaded onto somebody. So this basically the studies indicates where are the action points that we need to take. Ultimately, of course, as was pointed out, tariff is a major issue. It take the cross subsidy, and the gap needs to be filled up. Tariff needs to be revised, and with crop subsidy, suppose you want to keep it within plus minus 20%, then the load on the lower section, weaker sections will definitely increase, irrespective of political parties. I think it's a general political unanimity as far as the tariff is concerned. Nobody is, basically so comfortable in sharp hike in the tariff. So there's a process. There is no solution. We have been talking about it, but maybe gradual increase every year can be done. But unfortunately, in many states, the tariffs are not even revised for 5 to 6, 7 years. Of course, last few years it has improved, but there are states which never revise the tariff for 7 to 8 years at a stretch. And in one go, obviously, it's very difficult to really hike it. So my takeaway from these studies at the very preliminary stage is that it gives a lot of directions on which we can work, look at it, including revision of the tariff, which of course is a very, very difficult, and it's basically a political economy area, and it has its own implications. But I again congratulate the team CSEP for bringing out this report, and it gives a slightly different perspective, or I think the power be or the people in authority, when generally make sweeping statement that most of the issues are because of they call it inefficiencies of DISCOM, but in that inefficiencies there are certain factors which DISCOMs probably are not directly responsible. It lands in their books of accounts because they are the last leg in the whole value chain of the power sector, but maybe they have no control. For example, the cost of power procurement, absolutely they have no control. So that needs to be recognized, and I hope that there will be systemic pressure on all stakeholders, including DISCOMs, regulators, and others, to look at it whether they are doing what they are doing is are most optimum, or still there is a scope for improvement. And I understand that this study provides very clearly that there are scope to improve and do things better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pujari. I will come back to you on some suggestions you've given, and they lead to a lot of interesting ideas and suggestions. But I'll first turn to Ms. Josey, if you could share any opening remarks.
Yeah, I think, again, I will join in congratulating all the authors for the study, because I think it highlights many of the issues in the distribution segment. And I really like the articulation of what are the root cause analysis. So there's identification of what is the contribution of subsidy, what is the contribution of regulatory assets and losses is quite important in terms of prioritizing many of the issues. And I had a slightly different take on it. If 65% of the kind of cost can be attributed to certain areas, then clearly there are actions that can be taken because they are clearly identifiable. And in terms of the residual kind of part, I think somewhere in the presentation and in the report, there is this conversation about, how we really need to look at the tariff setting process differently in order to look at residual gaps. I'm not looking at the numbers. I mean, how we look at cumulative cash basis accounting. I think, Rahul, you and I have to have a separate wonkish discussion on that. But coming back to the issue itself, I think, this residual to me represents interest costs, disputed amounts, issues with planning, issues with power procurement, and they vary across states. So in Tamil Nadu, it might be because, tariffs haven't been increased for 7 years or so. And, obviously that means that revenue is not commensurate to the cost increase. In Karnataka, it could be because there has been significant disallowance by the regulator on major issues to ensure efficiency of the utility. And in Maharashtra, I think recently some of the, kind of rise in losses is also because of the dispensation under change in law. It's about 23,000 crores of increase in regulatory assets just because of the kind of dispensations that happen with change in laws. There are contractual issues which also affect the distribution company issues. And what I really feel is important for the conversation is the problems of the distribution company are not just because of the distribution company, it just happens to be at the end of the value chain. So we are essentially talking about inefficiencies across the value chain. And when we talk about distribution company losses and bailouts, it's the inefficiencies of the sector, right? And we really need to look at inefficiencies across the value chain, right from coal contracting, coal availability to collection efficiency and how to improve that. So definitely the conversation should not be about what the distribution company can do, but what all actors can do in order to make cost of supply better, in order to rationalize tariffs, and in order to prepare us for the challenges of the future. Because that conversation we haven't even had yet. Past and present challenges, we have some idea because we've been looking at it for the past 20 years. Now with renewables and storage, the entire game is going to change. And we really need to think about what happens when more and more consumers reduce their dependence on the utility, they move away, and what are the kind of cross-subsidy implications, revenue implications, and also how the entire role of the distribution company itself is going to change. I mean, one clear insight is the fact that right now we say, 70 to 75% of the cost is because of power purchase. I mean, in the future, it will be because of transmission, distribution, and storage, right, which are all fixed costs. So we are talking about an entirely different system which is going to emerge very soon. And therefore, we really need to think about not just past liabilities, present challenges, but also how we really think about adapting to this future system that's going to come. I'll just stop there for my opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Everyone's flagged so many things that I'm tempted to tear my questions that I've pre-prepared, because I think Mr. Pujari also started with this sort, and you've expanded it, which is DISCOMs are at the end of the chain, and yet there's all sorts of processes, systemic issues. They're not about right, wrong, or inefficient, because there are trade-offs along all of these. And so just to give an example, in the paper, we do go into, for example, the returns on equity that DISCOMs get, either statutory, like in the process, or of course, effectively they're negative. Your rate of return is negative when you're loss making. But you compare that with generation or transmission, they are lower risk and yet higher returns. And then in a separate CSEP paper, we compare this internationally. Just one snippet, what you referred to, Montek, is in the paper of the heterogeneity of consumer categories. So these are absolutely the larger conversations that we hope to get into. But I'll start with, before we come back to the future, because that's a nice place to end with, with the transition and all these big changes we have to prepare for. Let's assume we agree that certain numbers are off. Part of it could just be that, okay, it takes time to tweak them. But Mr. Pujari, you'd open with an observation that why can we not have normative things? So for example, if a state doesn't have a tariff petition filed in time, then the regulators, in theory, they are allowed as per the acts to have suo motu tariffs declared, which should have some inflation adjustment, but it's not quite happening. Now, here this flags an important issue, and we have a case example in the reports. It's not just what did the DISCOMs get, but also what did you ask for. So there is a case of a DISCOM where they've filed a petition that says, oh, I'm happy to take a 0% return on equity in the name of keeping tariffs low to help consumers. I mean, that just doesn't add up. It's not a scalable solution. So can we both at the same time, one, simplify the processes, but also inject some sort of baseline cost coverage which then leaves less to work out through a petitions process, through all these other things. How do we do it? I mean, do we need radical overhauls of the systems to get us in that direction, or can the current frameworks take us to that direction? Anyway, I mean, so I'll just mention that my questions in general are open to everyone, and I request everyone to please chime in.
Yeah. So every regulator, it comes out with multi-year tariff regulations, and that provides for various parameters and norms. And it is not specified anywhere in the Act that how these parameters are to be determined. Now, for example, it's very simplistic setting the rate of return on equity. The CRC does it, it was 11%, 12%, today it is 12%, tomorrow it could be 9%. So it depends on the context and the situation at which the decision are being taken. They are not specified anywhere. It is just a regulatory decision that you put in the tariff regulation, which is valid for 5 years. So you can have normative numbers. The only problem, we tried in many cases, in many cases, simpler ones we could do it, in a complicated ones we cannot do it. For example, the capital cost of a power plant. It's very easy to make it a normative number, but then it all varies from location to location, and sometimes the beneficiaries themselves come out saying that no, this is cheaper and the other one was costlier because you did the normative could be an average number. If you had done the realistic one, then I would have got a cheaper capital cost. All these issues do come. So it has to be exercise, has to be carried out, and it's not difficult, but only thing is that we need to come out with an acceptable number and along with the stakeholders. And this exercise is on. We realize that this exercise is on because with all these complications and n number of power plants, especially when the renewable power plants have come, unlike those old thermal power plants with 1000 megawatt capacity, your list number now every 100 megawatt capacities, everybody files a tariff petition, and it is getting more and more complicated and work. So normative, there is a group working, I understand, in CRC for getting normative. It is a difficult one, but I think at some point in time we need to do that. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to really manage the way things are. Only issue is that number should be acceptable. Nobody should again go and challenge those numbers, then everything gets stuck. Number two, idea is that it is much more expeditious and quick, and it is more predictable. And third is that maybe when you revise a normative, once you film a normative number, it doesn't mean that it is perpetuity, it is there. You can always revise it in every 3 years, 4 years. Maybe in the long run, I think somebody looks at it, in some year they'll lose, some year they'll gain or something like that. Overall, I think the trend will settle down. So this needs to be debated and finalized, not yet. Similarly, for state regulators also, when they do the tariff regulations, they can try to do this normative system. There are many there's groups working in forum regulators also for depreciations, for asset valuations. These are all predetermined formula are there, which becomes very, very easy, and you don't have to really work in detail and spend time on those numbers. So things are happening, but then the whole, if you really do a tariff setting, there are hundreds of parameters, and it takes time to finalize that. But it is doable, and I think we should try to move towards that.
Thank you. And I think that's exactly what, Mr. Bery had asked this question, what do other countries do? And that is exactly how some of them that we've studied end up, which is you won't get it right exactly every year, but then you will even it out over a few years. But unfortunately, as we've seen, we've got a skew in how a lot of things happen because your ex ante to ex post is unidirectional in consistently is what's happening. But just on this process, and I mean, building on this, when we went to states and talked to them and we talked to regulators, it turns into a very adversarial process. You talked about the petitions and the times and just the effort and so forth. But it's also almost like, well, let me ask for 5, even though my true cost is 3, because then maybe they'll give me 4. I mean, there's in certain tariff petitions, I mean, we've seen in states where the ask is always higher, then they know that they're going to get less than what they ask because of certain things happening in certain directions. I mean, the entire process isn't necessarily using the same set of assumptions, the same set of expectations or trajectories. And one of the reasons why you don't do it this way is because you said that, look, we know that, for example, certain costs have gone up by 6%. But then a regulator may say, no, we got to do better than that. The same thing happened with AT&C. Central government has been pushing, which is a good thing, states to have tighter targets. But do they go too far? I mean, if AT&C 1 year was 30, next year, is it realistic to expect them to be at 20% or whatever they've agreed to through some separate negotiation process or some separate policy process? Any, and you have some sort of, you're shaking your head or...
I was just listening to you. It stirred a different thought in my mind, and I just go on that. Basically, I think when we think about the regulatory business itself, I think many of these tensions and challenges are inherent to a cost-plus system. Because essentially you are telling utilities to declare certain costs, and that game will always be there of underestimation of fait accompli costs to make my tariffs look low, and overestimation of costs that will get disallowed. So I think that's a game which is inherent to the design of a cost-plus system. So maybe we could really think about what are the ways in which we can move away from a cost-plus system, or do we shrink the existing utility and reduce the amount where the cost-plus business is actually happening. And we have much more competitive pressures and more retail contracting in order to look at this. Maybe I can talk about that in another segment. But I think going back to the regulatory process itself, I think one big challenge is that regulatory accounts are not designed to really reflect the financial issues of the utility. They are basically to look at performance accountability. That is a function of a regulator, tariff setting and performance accountability. And this whole conversation about increasing tariffs, it should also account for the fact that there has to be some way of ensuring performance accountability of utilities. So regulators have to fulfill their role in a cost-plus system where costs are disallowed when there is inefficiency. And that over time will reduce the amount of inefficiency because there is less incentive to have that. But the issue is that much of these inefficiencies is being financed by working capital borrowings, right? Which is not in the regulatory purview. That is something that you see in the DISCOM accounts, and it is not even reported in any of the regulatory documents. So I think the regulators also should track some of these financial parameters to assess the health of the utilities. What is the actual working capital borrowing of utilities? It's not even reported in many of the audited accounts in a systematic manner. What is the extent of cumulative liabilities? We get this number on an ad hoc basis once in a while. But I think that will help nip some of these problems in the bud and look at DISCOM inefficiencies in a different manner. But whenever we talk about tariff increase, etc., we should definitely not restrict the regulator from doing their job of ensuring performance accountability. One example that I can give is, Maharashtra Regulatory Commission, I think very rightly did a detailed estimation of agricultural demand in the state based on looking at feeder metering data and looking at the kind of information which is there from surveys, and estimated that actually on an annual basis about 7,000 to 10,000 MUs is the overestimation of agricultural demand, which means that losses are underestimated by that extent. So, over a 7-year period, that translates to about 21,000 crores, which is essentially DISCOM inefficiency, which is passed on to consumers. Now, the regulator, was just allowed, obviously this is disallowed, and therefore there is a wrap on the utility to become more efficient. But if it is allowed, it would lead to a tariff increase and a better financial position, but we'll never be able to really isolate inefficiency. So that was the point that came to my mind.
So I think clearly metering would help, but smart meters could help for certain AT&C measurements, but they won't necessarily show up on agricultural pump sets.
I think my point was more about the role of the regulator itself. In the need to increase tariffs, we should balance it with the role of the regulator to really look at performance accountability. Otherwise, we will always have inefficient DISCOMs.
Absolutely. But now you flagged, so first is, of course, I hope we're not segmented into topic areas we can jump through, so please feel free to jump in. But raising tariffs, I'll come back to this. Yes, I agree with everything you've said. Even after that, even if we push DISCOMs to perform better, there will need to be tariff increases in some cases. Now the question becomes, A, we know it's political, but B, on whom or what are the processes to figure out? Like Mr. Pujari said, acts and legislation just give certain norms, but the details are all chosen by the regulators. So if I have to raise, I'm making up a straw man. Let's say tariff is short by 10%, and we agree that if after performance, after all these things, there's a high increase of a certain percentage needed. Does that mean everyone's tariff goes up equally? Does that mean the lower paying should come up more? Because this gets to the cross-subsidy issue that is at the heart. And we didn't discuss cross-subsidies here, but it is the focus of one of the two study reports. So the other finding we have is you cannot look at cross-subsidies and subsidies in isolation. They're very much linked. So how do we even get a process to figuring out, as opposed to leaving it as political or adversarial, or not me, but anyone else?
When you talk about cost of generation, I mean, this point I've been making for last so many years in my various capacities, but somehow I'm not able to convince. We should start looking at from the top. Look at the performance of Coal India, the coal pricing, and the railways. And very simple. I mean, nobody ask anybody, there is great slippage in the coal, and that great slippage cost get passed on to the DISCOMs. I mean, the coal company is responsible, the generator is responsible, the regulator is responsible, finally it goes to the... It's very simple. Now, great slippage, why should it take place? Are you so incompetent in government and Coal India or Ministry of Coal that you are not able to stop that? There are estimate how much, what is the great slippage on an average that takes place, and what is the cost that will pass on to the consumers. If you stop that, we estimated that about 10 to 12 paisa cost will come down. Your specific consumption of coal will come down. But we are not doing it. There is no political part in it. It is purely a central subject. How does the coal price get fixed? Is it get in a transparent manner? Who knows how it gets fixed? What is the cost of Coal India? It's a cost plus regime again. Whenever the demand for non-coking coal and coking coal changes, that to make the profitability, they keep balancing the cost. They increase the cost of coal and coking coal, and then reduce the cost of coking coal and increase on coking coal for the thermal power plant. And this all happens. So my point is that before we start talking about tariff increase at the last at the distribution level, we are not looking at our own internal thing, which is much easier to do. States are not involved in that. They'll be too happy to participate. It is between 3 ministries and government of India. It doesn't happen. You can carry out the studies. If the great slippage doesn't take, what is the price that will come down by? Automatically, the tariff will come down by 10 to 12 paisa on an average across.
But
So we should do it. The contract, fuel supply contract and the railway transport contracts are dated. They are simple 2-page, this thing without no risk. All the risk is on the buyer. The coal get handed over at the coal mine's end. The Coal India hands over, and the responsibility of Coal India is finished. It's at take or pay. The dump is there, you choose, you take it, otherwise you go home. The coal not available. These are the simple things. I mean, we should start from there. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. So we get into a very complicated part of it, and we should do that. Reduce the cost. I say, okay, I reduce the cost by 15 paisa. Now you increase the cost of another 15 paisa for that side. Consumer, you reduce it on 15 paisa this side, increase the cost of this thing, or remain same. You will balance 30 paisa. It's not difficult. It doesn't happen. So things which are doable, which can be done quietly, without much of thing, doesn't get done. And moment this thing comes, we straight away go to tariff revision at the last end, including agriculture, when everything gets derailed somewhere else. But so I got very strong views on this, but
So just correct me. I agreed with what you said, that it's almost like if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger, go up the chain. But if we did acknowledge grade slippage, wouldn't that reduce CIL's profits? So there you have the example of a trade-off.
In fact, the way the billing takes place, the coal gets billed. One bill comes as the billed coal as received, and coal as fired. Because when the coal leaves the mine, it gets, some particular GCB is there, and then billing is there at a particular rate. The coal travels 1,500 kilometers through whatever it happens. The quantity goes off somewhere, and nobody is responsible. Railway is not responsible for loss in quantity. Very clearly agreement written there. Railway is not responsible for loss in quantity, transition loss. That is the responsibility of the buyer. That means he is supposed to put people on the train and then make sure that nobody steals. I mean, that's the contract. So you lose about 3 to 4% of the coal goes away. Then the GCB part also goes away. So everything, this coal had received. After receiving, that takes about 7, 8, 10 days. It gets loaded, unloaded, all sorts of things happen there, and it gets stored at the power plant also. And from the storage, receive and to the firing, it takes another 30 days. So again, there is some slippage there. So you have 3 different parts. So earlier, the billing or the costing was done on the coal fired basis. With a lot of difficulties, we shifted one leg behind coal received basis. The best thing is to go back and take as a coal billed basis, basically. Then in that case, all the losses will get absorbed either at the generation level. So NTPC or any of the power plants will get hit badly, but it will not be passed on to the DISCOM. So that's one way of doing it. Now it's the Government of India's decision what to do.
So, I mean, what I hear is some of these may improve through market processes for parts of the chain, but we're so far away from making CIL coal a liquid market, no pun intended. Then you get wholesale liquidity, and then you get to retail market side. So there are discussions on DISCOMs. I'll switch gears a little on sort of DISCOM structure. It's not clear, neither because of the analysis, but also the institutional side, that until you get a number of things to align, just by saying, I'll let you be competitive, but the rest of the constraints look similar, am I going to really achieve change? Montek or, anyone?
Yeah, I just wanted to connect this point also to the rising tariffs bit, because I think your study has also pointed out that tariffs have actually been increasing at about 4.5% per annum over time. So there might be tariff shocks, but if you look at 16-year, in the long run, it is increasing at inflation. Near inflation. Right? So it's not...
4.5 is not inflation. Over that long period, our inflation rate has been higher.
I think it depends on what inflation we are looking at, whether it's CPI or WPI. But I think the point is, more or less, there has been some amount of tariff increase that is happening. So it's not like, tariffs are being stalled across. And I think we need to acknowledge that tariff increase has been happening, but cost has been increasing at a much faster rate. That is the crux of the issue. And I think because of the recent changes that are happening, there is also a limit to how much tariff increase can happen in the future also. I think your study has also shown that the average cost of supply is 7.91 rupee per unit. Right now, that means 8 rupees per unit. So, anybody who goes for open access, captive or rooftop can get power at 5 rupees per unit. So clearly, there is a 30% saving right there. So a lot of consumers who can afford to shift or migrate are going to do that. So even if tariffs are increased, how will that recovery happen is a big question mark. So it may not really, make the situation for the DISCOMs much better. And another consequence of rising tariffs could be that actually subsidies rise commensurate to the tariffs. And what that really means and what its implications are very important to understand. As I understand, subsidy payments and delays have actually improved over the years. But going forward, if the subsidy quantums itself increase, then we are going to end up in another situation where working capital borrowings, etc. of DISCOMs are much more of a challenge, and also affect the fiscal health of the state governments itself. So I think, in Karnataka right now with the new announcements, we're talking about 50% of the ARR as a subsidy bill. If you look at agriculture and domestic together, That is clearly unsustainable. And if more and more states head in that direction, that could be one of the consequences of raising the tariffs. So we should really think about raising tariffs more from, what is the role of subsidy and cross subsidy, and also with the changing market dynamics, whether rising tariffs will really result in rising revenue is something that we need to consider.
Just on a small housekeeping note, Mr. Bery is on his way and will join us. So I'll hold off on one question that may be of interest on the future side and the transition, because that's a huge area of national interest. Do we have, you alluded to this in the Maharashtra study, but even on the coal, you've got this issue of grades and slippage and so forth. Do we trust the data? In general, I don't know on the financial side between, fiscal, those books should hopefully be better. But a lot of the other books, is that a factor? And if so, what do we do about it? Because, what we've seen is the terminology is different. What you get away with, just as one example, we've heard the term regulatory asset, which is the creation of the a receivable where the tariff was not raised enough so that it will be recovered in the future. But that is actually listed as an income by some in the P&L by some states. So we've got all sorts of numbers where everyone, and now I'm making a oversimplification, we're reverse engineering. If somebody says your AT&C target is X, because agriculture has such a unknown, because it's unmetered, we can always meet certain things just by reverse engineering. Are we too much having a system that's playing to targets as opposed to playing to performance?
This is a surprise. You mean the regulatory asset is granted, that is shown as income?
In a P&L, but it then ends up as a receivable in your balance sheet.
I think that
introduced by our regulator, by our consultants, the Delhi regulator.
No, I can understand that, but how you treat it. The important thing is if you're showing it as a regulatory asset, what you're really saying to the distribution company is that actually you're not going to get this money now, but you will earn a return on it. And if the return that you're earning is more, then let's say the interest loss.
Mike, sorry, your mic is not on. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I don't even want to ask people in the audience because then Suman is turning up.
Yeah.
And
We had
might
one
wanna-
more thread, which was just towards the future. I was just, looking at, you alluded to it, the RE aspect. So on one hand, we are supporting renewables as we should. We've got not just the support on the renewable side, but on the tariffs, we've got green open access, for example, put in. So now the cream customers are the ones, like you said, they've got enough margin that they want to leave. What do you see as a viable equilibrium? The question isn't will they do it or won't they? It's what will happen to the rest of the system. Because right now you have a social welfare redistribution scheme through your tariffs of cross subsidies. And as our paper documented, in FY19, half the units sold were violating the cross subsidy norms. And that was ex ante. We're not even able to do it ex post because we don't have certain breakdowns of the actual sales by category because of the slab variations. So is green going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back?
I think green is something that is much more viable, but and that's probably why it is taking competition forward. But I think what we really need to think about is what does this mean for the role of the distribution company itself and how is it changing? How do we really need to recalibrate and think about tariffs itself? So if we are thinking about a system where there is a higher amount of renewable energy and many more consumers are moving to alternate supply options, then what is the role of the DISCOM? Is it really, the supplier, or is it the supplier of last resort? Is it the, entity that ensures power procurement for the entire state, or is it one of the entities that procures power for a smaller segment of consumers who are unable to migrate? So the role of the DISCOM will change, and we really need to think about how DISCOM's pricing strategy also needs to change based on the services that it's providing. Right now, it's all bundled into one tariff, but actually there are multiple services within that one tariff itself. So how do we really think about standby services? How do we really think about banking? Can they be at cost? Because definitely many of these users who are looking at the DISCOM as a grid service provider or a system operator rather than a provider of supply, the entire model is very, very different. So I think we really need to think about ways in which cost compensation for DISCOM services can be improved, and how we really think about regulatory frameworks to institutionalize that, so that when the problem is there or the challenges are there, we are well prepared and we have clarity. I think that's very, very critical.
You mentioned that the
Sorry,
green
so your
energy
mic is off.
cheap. Sorry, you mentioned that.
One more. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that green energy is cheap, so guys want to take it, right? But I mean, that's only when it's available. So their model is that when it's available, I'll take it, and then when it's not available, I'll get stuff from the grid.
Right.
And it's the grid's problem what they do with the.
So I think one of the reasons is because time of day tariffs are not priced accordingly. I mean,
But
there are
that's the most. I mean, well, you made that point. Isn't that the first thing we should do? Yeah, bataiye, what is the problem? Why is it not happening?
And it's a known solution.
Yeah, I don't solution, but everybody recognizes yes, there is a need to do it. In fact, when we found that the states are not doing what we tried, but I think we didn't succeed much. In this 2019-24 tariff regulations, we brought in at the generation level the equivalent to time of the day tariff, equivalent to based on season and morning and evening. I said let's increase the cost of the generation so that automatically it gets reflected in the thing. But then there were so much of opposition. And then, of course, we couldn't do it nationally because every region has their own peak time different, morning time is different, seasonally different. So we left it to the regional committee to decide. But we have tried. But I think there is a time that the state's regulators or the state government does it again. But the question comes ultimately, the price is going to go up, and the peak time. So, in the morning the price will go up, evening the price will go up when the maximum consumption of electricity takes place. So again, the same opposition.
How so?
Exactly the same opposition. See, if you increase the price in the afternoon, probably nobody mind. But if you increase the price in the morning and evening, there will be much more opposition than general increase in prices.
I would say it also encourages industrial consumers to use power when renewable is available. So it will flatten the load curve to some extent. Not all consumers are residential, right?
Agree. But then, say, whole tariff increases our mindset, or generally think that you looked at those sensitive categories, and then what is their response? I mean, basically, so everything got driven by that. Unfortunately, it may not be true what we think, but then that's the perception everywhere. So they say that general increase is so difficult, so you increase the peak time, it's much more difficult. That's why nobody does it. Otherwise, it's very simple. Everybody knows about it, and not a very difficult. Implementable is not the issue. Implementation,
But
not getting done.
I'll push back a little bit on that. Intellectually, it's simple, but the impact on different consumer categories will be asymmetric. So now we're back to the more fundamental question of the social welfare equilibrium. Today, you have cross subsidies based just on aggregate averages. But now if I hypothetically, for the future, added in a TOD aspect to the cost structure, the cost to serve. So today, all cross subsidies are calculated pretty much based on average cost of supply. But if I started now looking at what is your impact on the grid by you as a different type of consumer, then industry should be paying even less if they actually align with cheaper, greener power or cheaper power. I mean, so then isn't that going to strain that equilibrium even further and create a resistance? I mean, you've said it's simple, but I see that tension as also being enormous.
Industry impact will be slightly different.
I mean, industries can also go for or be encouraged to go for open access and therefore reduce the power procurement pressure on the DISCOM in the first place. So that can be another way of cost reduction rather than looking at only TOD tariffs. If there are right incentives and TOD tariffs, maybe they will sign their own contracts and get their power, therefore reducing the need for the utilities to plan for their demand in the first place, which would definitely reduce costs.
But again, it's going to be the cream that's doing that. So it may reduce costs, but it's the relative reduction vis-a-vis all the categories that would matter for that equilibrium that we have. Because just as one reminder, this, we've all, or many of us may have heard of something called the duck curve. This is the famous curve where the shape of your demand after taking out RE supply, which is called net demand, look like the shape of a duck. This year, in California, it has now been called the canyon curve because it has hit zero in the middle of the day. So that's the level of, I mean, I worry that all of our discussions are all incremental tweaking as opposed to these huge shifts within the next 5 years that, or when, I mean, whether it's 5 years or 7 years, 10 years is a different story. But are we ready for it from a regulatory, tariff, and all these other processes? I don't know. I mean,
but you know, I mean, if you have to make a shift, making it slowly is easier to absorb in due course.
Yeah.
If you make a huge shift, I mean, everybody will object. But a little bit of a shift, maybe you can get it through.
but small shifts are done within your framework. I'm saying, would the frameworks need to change?
Yeah, that's a
Is
fair
what
point.
we may need to do.
One other point, and that was, you know, this whole issue of to promote solar energy, that it would be better if we did net metering rather than a feed-in tariff. Was there a very strong sort of pushback from the DISCOMs to only give a feed-in tariff?
Now it's well settled, I think. Now it is all, there's no issue on that now. It's all well settled.
In what way is it settled?
No more feedback.
What? No more what?
There is hardly any rooftop solar getting deployed, right?
No, but that's because you're not allowing net metering now.
No, but with net metering, actually, the issues on DISCOM will become much more worse because that's not.
Well, but you know.
Because you're just supplying energy and you are getting paid for energy plus transmission plus distribution plus all other costs.
Plus peaking
it's just
cost, plus peaking power.
So it's just not viable, sustainable.
You had a point.
Sir, I was trying to look at a future perspective lens because one has lived through all these motions through the 80s and 90s and seen all this happening. Now, I was just thinking...
Sorry, Mr. Rastan, one mic, if you could.
I said one has seen through almost half a century all these things happening and you've been part of it for a long time, sir. I was just looking at it this way, that I think ultimately the answer lies in smart metering and being able to settle accounts across whatever is your tariff, and your public system will be like a public distribution system, PDS, meeting only the emergencies if you really are going to go into decentralized generation. And decentralized generation has to come in a very big way, in a sense that all your building material, your building designs, your architectural approvals will have to say that you have to generate so much of your own power. Some strong segments like that, if you mean business. Where is the land in our country to put up all the solar generation that, you know, we are talking about? Hydro, yes, we have virtually exhausted, I think, what we have. Number two, we are talking of pumped hydro now as storage. I do not know how easy it will be to get those sites, to get that land for pumped hydro for those locations, barring a few projects in the beginning. So I think the perspective has to be right, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Bery.
Not at all, please.
Welcome, sir. Thank you. Sorry. The perspective has to be seen maybe in a 10, 20, 30-year perspective today already. We have to be future ready. If we really mean decentralization, the central system, I repeat again, will probably be only serving the PDS. And that will have to be heavily subsidized for the electoral reasons or whatever you might say. The other part, if you want emergency power to make up for yourself, every 15-minute slot or something on the grid will tell you what is the cost of the power. And you will have to jolly well buy it. We've all lived through 100 rupees a litre for petrol. And when I was a schoolboy, it was 2 rupees a gallon. So we've seen this kind of inflation coming through. And the same will come through here if you want that assured power. Otherwise, arrange for your own power if you really mean business. A regulator's job is not easy at all.
So,
But just to end, I think, we could talk of DISCOMs, and I've seen it in Haryana when we were discussing this thing, went up from the electricity board to Mr. Bansilal, to whom you could not argue very much. And there were the GENCOs, there's TRANSCOs, but none of you ask why not DISCOs. It was suggested DISCOs. He said, what is DISCO? So DISCO became DISCOM. So it's become a source of discomfiture ever after.
So, Ms. Bery, we've had very intense deliberations which are recorded, to answer your question. And I think there's one or two takeaways we want to bring to your attention that can now bring us now towards the question and answer, more discussion from experts. We have, some of the leading experts in India, Mr. Razan, and, on storage, on energy efficiency in many domains. Is we always historically have looked at it in a relatively silo mechanism, that DISCOMs and within DISCOMs AT and C. But DISCOMs are just at the last leg of the chain. And so there are whole hosts of other structural issues, if not inefficiencies, that are there in generation, in coal contracting, and all of the above. So I think one of the suggestions was almost to the extent, at one end, if you can't solve a problem, make it larger. You've got to tackle all of these things because they're deeply intertwined. And second, and I'm now paraphrasing what I hear from a lot of folks, solar is now what, 2.5 rupees? Why is my tariff so darn high? And so that's going to put very immense pressure, because on one hand we are encouraging, and we, quite frankly, we're leaders in the world in our renewable ambitions. But that again puts pressure back on the equilibrium and the DISCOM structure that we have. So I think these were two of the key sort of points that came up amongst many others. So I leave it to you. Would you like to hear some discussion from the audience or share some thoughts on just...
Well, no. I remember Meryl Streep saying at an Academy Awards, "Oh no, not that lady again." So I think I've already used up your airtime. I've come for the coffee and for the fraternity. I've said what I have to say. I'd love to hear the discussion. As you know, that had always been, as it were, where I wanted to come in. And so if I'm stimulated by some of the remaining comments, I may wish to react, but otherwise to interact with people over coffee is just as much reward for being here. But ultimately I'm here to show respect and solidarity for this kind of detailed, careful work, and then to take away from this what this means for NITI's interaction with the states, okay? So I'm just coming from a meeting with the Prime Minister, and which is not about this, but really the issue of, as it were, state fiscal performance, state fiscal capacity, state fiscal management. These are central dimensions, and you can't really address those without taking a view on the DISCOM performance. But as a general, as it were, philosophy, thinking about, India 2047 or some nearer term, this is a world entire. So how does one learn and bridge across states? Best practice, a lot of variety in terms of regulators, a lot of variety even in terms of market structure. I'm sure it's in there, it wasn't there. But what that then actually means for assisting states is really, and the importance of this, that's why I grabbed the opportunity to attend even briefly. And now back to the show.
Thank you so much for taking time from such a schedule. I can only imagine. We're grateful. And your questions that you posed actually got discussed, some of them in this. So thank you for those and we played them early before our deliberations. I think one just point before I open it up for a few, we're time constraint, but we will have a few key questions, is we do need a lot of new stuff. I mean, new frameworks, new ideas, new whatever, instruments. But we already have a bunch of instruments which we're not using today. And Mr. Ahluwalia opened up with a question that here you have a national tariff policy which is effectively being ignored by the states. They're giving half the units, for example, in violation of the national tariff policy when it comes to cross subsidies. Similarly, you've got, there is a rule that says no regulatory assets should be created. APTEL has ruled that upon the regulatory commissions, and yet they have been created. So now, is it an enforcement problem? I'm not sure we have an answer to that question, but that's just one other thread that came up, and maybe someone has some thoughts on that. I'll leave that statement there, and now request very brief, directed, if appropriate, questions to anyone who's here in the audience. If you could just keep it very brief, wait for a mic.
Good evening, everyone.
It's not on, sorry.
Esteemed panel, I'm Anshuman Swai from Deputy Director, Central Electricity Authority. I just have one observation. There was a lot of discussion on the regulatory issues that the DISCOMs are really facing, and petitions are also pending. So should not there be a focus on strengthening the regulators at the state level even more by having, more specialized personnel manning those posts and expanding them so that the processes of the petitions can be, fast forwarded. So those are the time that it takes is reduced. So overall, that can, have an effect on the efficiency of the DISCOMs as well.
I mean, this is one of the questions. How much can the center do? And maybe NITI has a role within this to strengthen the states. But one of the things that we flagged in the report is a regulatory cadre. One of the things, just one example of maybe what could be done. Is that one of the things that...
Already there is a cadre, like we have a Central Power Engineering Services cadre.
But not a regulatory cadre. Not a regulatory cadre. And these are new skills we'll need with the energy transition upon us, including markets, including so many other aspects, which used to be a very engineering-centric approach to the problem. I think we have to move beyond an engineering-centric approach to this problem. Lavish, you had a...
I promised myself I won't take up any of your time, but what Mr. Pujari said, just threw up something. I think this is a classic prisoner's dilemma. You have an upstream monopolist, and you have a downstream DISCOM, which is state-owned. If this DISCOM becomes financially strong, it is in the interest of the upstream monopolist to charge more. Given this, both entities, one will charge more, the other will charge the customers less. And in such a situation, the only answer is an independent regulator, except that here, the regulator has been taken over by both the upstream monopolist and the downstream DISCOM, because the people from the regulatory people are actually coming from there. So this is actually a fairly standard economic problem, which has very well-known solutions, which is completely independent regulation.
But even if they're independent, right now you've got structural lock-ins, like the coal contracts that Mr. Pujari mentioned. It's from, in fact, all our system is a pass-through. You've got FSA becomes PPA. PPA becomes tariffs, etc. And so until that whole thing goes through the chain, like, I'm not sure how we can tackle it piecemeal.
I'll just respond to just 1 minute. As far as the regulatory strengthening is concerned, no, apart from the cadre, that is not going to help. What happens is that things are so dynamic and flux, and we require new knowledge, capacity, technology, understanding, and global, what is happening globally. So if you, in our government system, if you build a cadre, then that cadre becomes, you can't do anything about it. So it is always better to have a mix of the basic minimum, and you always have experts available outside, and then hire them, and then only thing is that you do the capacity building. So and those, every regulator, at least in CRC, we know we hire good people. I mean, in the sense that we pay huge amount of money and hire them, because if you're going to think about the market intelligence, nothing available in India, so we had to go to FERC, had a MOU with them, exchange with them, got people from them, and then develop our own internal capacity. So this all happens. So this is basically all the things are available. So not necessary that you have your own people throughout, and then very honestly, I'm saying that they stay with you for 30 years, and beyond a point, they really don't have incentive to really learn more, because anyway, they are reaching their top level as per the government progression. So it is always better to have a mix. And what is that ideal mix depends from organization to organization, institution to institution. So let's not prescribe that. Let each organization and institution decide how to go about it. That's it.
Would you agree with the belief that the center CERC is in far better position regarding compared to the SERCs?
Absolutely. I no doubt about it. SCRCs are in very, very difficult positions, and half the time the members are not there, they're not staff enough, and the people who are there also are not very trained. I mean, that's unfortunate. Not only as a regulator, the load dispatch center, the STU, the STU and SLDCs are absolutely in, I think, what stage they are in primitive stage. I mean, we talk about everything in the government of India, but look at the counterpart at the state level, they have difficulties. I mean, let's not talk about it. It's very, very pathetic, and then because that's not important for anybody, but for the system to run, so you have to do it. But all these institutions need strengthening, and you have to recognize them. And these are the important areas. People probably not non-glamorous sort of work, and then many people don't. They like to be in DISCOM on the field. They don't want to come back and then sit in the STU or do the planning, or maybe in the SLDC do the load dispatch, because they're not visible. So unfortunately, the whole incentive system in the government is something else that there are not enough, and lack of manpower also. That's also one part of it. But we need to sensitize every institutions as far in the power sector, because it's going to be more and more complicated. Once you have decentralized generation everywhere, you're going to have a lot of issues. And earlier, the cost was less. Today, every decision you take has a huge cost. The question I was also raised, saying that what is the real cost of renewable? It is 2 rupees 30 paisa, the last bid, or something else? Yes. What is that? I mean, honestly, you should tell. I mean, it's not that nobody is against renewable, but point is that once you recognize that it costs 7 rupees for 1 unit of renewable, then your decision making will be correct. But you don't want to do it.
Okay.
Every cost has to be loaded onto that. I mean, whatever it is. So we need to be very, very careful about the costing part of it, honest about the cost, and take appropriate decisions.
Thank you. And I guess it comes back to also processes, that what is your mechanism for even figuring out what is the cost of renewables? Is it through bids only? Is it through a integrated plan, a centralized mechanism? I mean, there's so many questions that are yet to be answered. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, Alec, Ritu.
I'll be quick. So I touched on this exactly, right? So there's a disconnect where RE is done through bids. So we know exactly what the cost of round-the-clock RE is. It's about 4 or 4.5, depending on these latest RTC bids. And you mentioned that cost plus is a structural flaw. So coal is on cost plus, RE is on bids. Right now, RE is very, very small. It's about 10% of India's wind and solar, that is, including hydro. That's going to grow to 20, 30, 40. So not only are we saving, where we're going from coal from 5 to 4.5 for RE, RTC RE, that is, but we're also saving, this report's saying that no, coal's not 5. Coal's actually 5.66. There's that extra 66 paisa per kilowatt hour post hoc versus ex ante, if I read the report correctly.
Not quite. We'll discuss offline.
Okay. Yeah. But so my question for Anne and for others is, as that renewable percentage goes up from 20 to 30 to 40 to 50, if instead of just letting open access consumers do it, we actually force the DISCOMs to be more aggressive in their RE build, does some of this problem go away?
I think even if we force open access consumers to go away, we might have potential for about 100 gigawatts. But if you're really thinking about meeting a lot of our new demand through renewable energy and not through coal, we really need much more aggressive RE deployment. And there we need to think of different solutions, different ways of doing it, centralized, decentralized, solar parks, solar feeder, everything is required because the ambition and the requirement to meet all new demand through RE is so significant. And I think bringing that change in would also, I mean, part of it also depends on how fast storage can really accelerate. So actually having test cases on ground, pilots, before mid-decade, operational cases to really ensure Rahul is smiling. But I think all those things are very, very critical. And therefore, the next 7 years are absolutely fundamental to which direction the transition is really going to go. And we really need to focus on that.
Yeah, so my question was again a little bit more...
Is it on? Sorry.
So basically getting back to the entire supply chain and getting the real value, the real costs into our decision making, and coming back to the point of whether the central authorities are better facilitated or the state can manage this better. If you look at the entire transition, at some point we are going to move towards more renewables, more decentralized, and in order to prepare for that, at this point, do we need to start looking at maybe piloting or trying to assess something at the state level while we are recognizing that the center is so much in a better position to still manage this? But in the future, you're going to have a very different mix. You're probably going to have some kind of trickle-down effects of carbon pricing in some manner or the other. So we are looking at the entire supply chain, and we've brought this up in many of the discussions already. But what is it going forward that we should look at? Only the national strengthening or the state planning is what I wanted to bring up.
Thank you. Just on that, maybe a suggestion, if NITI could encourage. Pilots have been around for a long time, but most of them end up being sort of either proven or such that there's not enough risk-taking with pilots. I would love to see more than just technology pilots. Most pilots are technology, but we have not had enough innovation, risk-taking for other types of pilots, because part of it may be just that nobody wants to fail, because the risks, quote unquote, of something not working, but the ambitions we have, the scale we need, nobody knows the right answer to some of what we're trying to do anywhere in the world for the energy transition. We may need very riskier, different types of pilots as well. Just a thought. Okay, last word, since you've been very patient.
Quickly. Thank you.
Dr. Narula.
Kapil Narula, consultant with the UN and formerly with NITI Aayog as advisor energy. Looking at the study and the results of the study, where you highlighted that there are different problems with different states. Some states are doing very well, others have different challenges. So in terms of solutions, should we treat DISCOMs as heterogeneous and look at different solutions for different states? For example, Arunachal Pradesh would be very different, and the solution for that would be very different than Maharashtra or Haryana. So should we treat everything in a homogeneous way, or should we have different solutions? Thank you.
I mean, I think you've answered your own question, but the report certainly goes into it. But if I look at central government plans and schemes, they've often, like for example, till a few years ago, we had one AT&C target across the country. That has evolved, luckily, but it's nowhere near as heterogeneous as it could be, or maybe should be. And
I think regulators have different targets and trajectories, and finally that's what results in the cost. So, for distribution as well as for collection efficiency, at least in the tariff processes, the tariffs are different. But I wanted to just go back to the comments that were coming, especially with respect to center-state roles and what kind of innovations can happen with different realities in different states. I think one is, of course, that we really need alignment of both center and state. I don't think there is a lot of learning that states have because of the experiences and the realities that they face, which also inform central sector policies. And at the same time, the center can play a very good role in terms of setting broad frameworks while allowing flexibilities for states to certainly innovate and take things ahead. And while recognizing that many states are different, there are definitely ideas that are scalable. which come from states. So one clear example is, the KUSUM program. I mean, they were essentially pilots that happened in different states, in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, and in Rajasthan, which kind of got scaled up and became part of the KUSUM scheme. Saubhagya is another very good example. I mean, that national scheme basically came by the program that Bihar had launched for providing connections to APL consumers. So definitely trying to give space to states to innovate, seeing what cross-learning can take place, and seeing what scaling up can take place. So we have done some kind of, documentation of some of these good case practices that are emerging from states on different aspects, about 10 different, themes, so to speak. And I can share that also with the audience later.
Thank you very much. We've had a very rich discussion that went over, but I think a good flexible power system or flexibility means adaptability. So we've slightly exceeded our targets. We've exceeded our targets in this particular case. But I would now like to invite and request Mr. Bery or Mr. Ahluwalia, Mr. Pujari or Ms. Josey, if they have any thoughts, because I don't think we've closed the conversation, hopefully. There are enough points. I mean, Ritu, you threw in the word just in passing, CBAM. That itself would require another hour of discussion to handle how carbon pricing may impact the electricity sector. But we'll hold that for the next event. And any thoughts or remarks, if, Mr. Bery?
Let me come last.
Okay, Montek.
Well, I think I just mentioned something that Anne pointed out, that in our thinking of how the power sector is going to evolve, we have to take into account the fact that if 2070 is net zero, more or less, then the percentage of our electricity that has to come from renewables is going to increase massively. And we know that renewables are also intermittent. So if you've got a situation where supplies are going to vary, it's very unlikely that we can manage that if prices don't vary in response. So the whole time of day pricing, which was touched upon earlier, but the feeling was that, it's not really feasible or attractive. I mean, somehow we need to... Huh? Sorry?
I mean, that's not the only, yeah.
Politics at the moment doesn't do very...
No, I recognize that, but what I'm trying to say is that when you have 7 to 8%, 10% of your electricity coming from renewables, you can always ramp up the rest of the system to provide to levelize the supply. When you've got 80% coming from renewables, the peaking problem is unavoidable. The storage issue will be unavoidable. Cost of stored power will be much higher, hopefully not as high as it is now if technology improves. But in that environment, I mean, we might as well start now persuading states or whatever that time of day metering is a good thing. And time of day metering should map what you call the duck shape or the canyon shape or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And how you do that in a regulatory framework and what flexibility you can give to the regulators is an important issue. And the other is what you said, that we must think of the centralized method as only a way of providing kind of like a PDS for electricity. And everybody else does their own deals with whoever's willing to supply them at whatever price. And in the end, that would actually affect location decisions. I mean, if electricity is cheaper here than there for whatever reason, we don't have to go back to the steel price equalization that we used to have in the 1970s. We just have to recognize that that will be reflected in the comparative position of different states. But I don't see that at the moment, at least at the state level. I don't see that even having entered the discussion. So I mean, think tanks and research institutions need to feed it in. And ideally, this would be easier to feed in if there were state-level institutions that were pushing the case. If you do it through a national institution, it always looks like a bit of a plot, and people think something is being rammed down their throat. It's surprising how limited I mean, there are some very distinguished institutions, you, for example, and others, 3 or 4 in the country. But actually, you need, on the whole issue of electricity pricing, a lot more state-based research institutions feeding stuff into both the public, the local industry, the CM, and so on.
Sensitization for a future shock.
Yeah.
Shift. Let's not call it a shock.
Sensitization for a future challenge. Let's call it that. But it's a very big, I mean, the variability issue is massive, you know?
Yeah, I think I'd like to end by saying that DISCOM challenges are complex, they're persistent, they've been there for a very long time. And dealing with them is going to take a long time. And the system itself is going to change. But what is really important is to see with technology, with the transition, are there ways to align some of the opportunities that are there to address some of the persistent challenges before the DISCOM? So can we use low-cost solar in order to provide agricultural supply during the daytime, which reduces the cost of supply itself? You know, looking at time of day pricing, actually our energy transition preparedness initiative study has clearly shown that some states have done very, very interesting innovations. Like for example, Kerala, you know, they have one of the highest TOD tariffs in the country because most of their load is residential. So it makes a big difference for them. You know, it's about 25 to 50% of the energy charges that they have as TOD tariffs. Uttar Pradesh, right, is a state which has TOD tariffs that vary on a seasonal basis. No other state in the country has that. So they're already more and more aligned to the kind of variability in demand and supply that's going to happen with renewables. Delhi is a very good example because all consumers, most consumers who are 10 kilowatt and above have TOD applicability, which is the lowest kind of threshold in the country. So states are doing very innovative things and actions that fly or that really take off are ones that are able to align with their realities, with the challenges that they face. And in some way, if you could think of reducing the liabilities or reducing the costs, then scalability of those actions from a transition perspective can take place. Another point I wanted to make is because so much of the conversation is around transition. It's not like states that have poor finances are lagging behind in terms of transition initiatives. I mean, many of these states are doing very pioneering things. And that also needs to be recognized, that poor finances need not be a barrier in terms of taking up many technology adoption issues. I mean, storage pilots are being done in states which have, you know, poor finances, for example. So I think the point is that we really need to look at DISCOM finance as an issue that is not going to go away in a year or two. It's a persistent issue and we need to see how to live with it.
It'll just change.
Yes.
A lot of issues were discussed and many of the issues are known. And of course, we debate the solutions, and being a federal country and every state being unique and every DISCOM within a state being unique, I think no, the common decision making doesn't take place. But one point is very clear. Whatever we articulate, our ambition, for example, net zero by 2050 or 2070, or say 300 gigawatt of renewable by so and so date, it has very clearly we should articulate, we should recognize what are the implications of these. And since the way electricity sector is structured, we have to work with the state and DISCOMs, because as in today it is a concurrent subject and we need their support and they have to go along with us. So there is a need to articulate our ambition and translate it into what is going to happen and who is going to do what, and carry all the stakeholders together. Then it gets implementable. Sometimes what happens, we articulate something and then probably in our own way you try to do, and then suddenly the resistance comes and it gets stuck someplace. We need to really debate and articulate and write it down very clearly and understand the implications and make everybody understand that yes, even if it is a cost to the society, but then for good that we are doing, how are you going to finance that cost? How are you going to pass on that cost? Who is going to bear that cost? And these are the issues that needs to be debated. If we say that the cost goes up by 5 rupees, do you want to pass on the whole thing to the consumer? Or you absorb part of it, pass on part of it? This debate is required so that everybody on the same wavelength when you get implemented all these crucial decisions. Second, just 1 or 2 points I want to respond, sir. Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia talked about that the time of the day metering or cost when you really have high solar. Even today, in the daytime, the thermal power plants get back down. And that cost is there. It is getting socialized. It doesn't get reflected in the tariff, but the cost gets socialized. So anyway, today, these costs are there, but they are in a very, very non-transparent way. That's why the point that I made earlier is, unless we really make all these costs very, very transparent and bring them on the book and say that this is the cost, then debate will take place. How are you going to apportion it? How are you going to finance it? Who is going to bear what? That is what the debate is. Nobody is questioning saying that you don't have renewable. But question is that if renewable has a cost, who is going to bear it? I mean, is it government of India, state government, consumers, or DISCOMs? Who is going to bear it? That the debate is required. And that debate is where the solution will lie. So we need to be very transparent, clear-cut, and find out the cost implications of each of our decisions and debate with the stakeholders to see how this cost has to be apportioned. The best person who can bear it, like this is the risk has to be allocated to the person who can really mitigate the risk best. Similarly, the cost has to be allocated to the agency where he can bear it best. So I think that's where my understanding and looking at is that I think we are lacking slightly. We need to increase that debate and in a transparent manner and bring out that this is the cost, and we need to address that cost, how we want to finance it. Thank you.
The last word, Mr. Bery.
Well, I'm very pleased that my colleague Ritu Mathur is here. She'll have a chance to brief me on the discussion. And of course, Rahul, you always make yourself available. So just riffing on some of the stuff that has come up even in the last 10 minutes. 3 or 4 points. I mean, we always think that India is unique and exceptional, and in some ways it is, but exactly what it is about India that's unique and exceptional, that means the lessons from other countries, forget other states, do not apply here. So, I mean, the market design issues that Lavish referred to exist perhaps in other places. So are there solutions to these problems? Are there regulatory solutions? Are they market design, industrial organization issues? So that's one thought. Second, the model that the Prime Minister has in mind is of cooperative and competitive federalism. And so is it the case that the institutional structure does not stimulate innovation, or does it stimulate innovation? Which is to say that are there payoffs, on what kinds of payoffs to, in a sense, having more transparency in the cost structure, having more transparency, or less cross-subsidy. So are there political or political economy mechanisms that should be invoked, can be invoked? And third, to come back in a sense to my first point, which is that is being a latecomer an advantage or a disadvantage? Is there anything like leapfrogging sort of in this business? A question, I don't know. But finally, the issue of state capacity. Why is it that that capacity is so eroded, as Mr. Pujari had to say? It must, and are there, again, significant differences across states that we can learn from? So what's come across, even in, as I say in my 10 minutes here, is that this is a very important topic to engage states on. There is work that's been done here that we do need to have a 20 or 30-year kind of horizon, and we need to learn from the states and learn from international experience. But it should not only be about engineering or institution, it should also be about economics. And I think that is, in some ways, where actually the whole system tends to fall down. That we look to institutional, but the kinds of ways in which Lavish formulated that question, that doesn't emerge very spontaneously out of the dialogue at the state level, and that perhaps is a contribution NITI can make. Thanks, Rahul.
Thank you, Mr. Bery, Mr. Ahluwalia, Mr. Pujari, Ms. Josey, for very deep, rich, and extended conversation, which opens the door to more conversations. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today online as well as in person. And before I invite you, everyone, to join us for refreshments and high tea, a request. Well, first, thank you to our panelists, and especially Mr. Bery for coming so far back to join us. And if I could just request everyone to just join us to take a quick picture with the reports, then we will close. Thank you, everyone. Yes. Yeah. If we could, yeah. Oh, he wants us to sit down, I think. We all have to listen to the photographer. Sorry. Please decide. Oh, don't cover our faces. Okay. Sit down. No, he said don't cover the face. It's better standing. I'm so sorry. Thank you.